All right, let's get started. Welcome back. So it looks like everybody submitted their assignments. We're grading them. They should be done later this weekend. Look at whether you submitted your server was configured correctly. We've been visiting all your websites. It should just say hello for now, just hello world. I see that a lot of you are working on your first assignment on creating the form maker, right? And there's been a lot of questions and been answering them in Piazza. Please use Piazza, to ask questions. Okay, I know some of you are sending me email to my Gmail account, and it's just easier to keep track of them if they're all in Piazza. Okay? Even if it's just one-to-one, you can just send me a private a message. Right? It's just easier for me to keep track of the messages as opposed to checking several places. All right. So anything related to the class, it's easier to keep track there. Let's look at the agenda where we are. So let's see. According to the agenda, we are going to complete our second module, the user interface development, today. Right. So we've been talking about HTML, CSS, responsive design for last week and a little bit of this week. We started talking about using CSS to accomplish grid systems. We'll take a look at Bootstrap. Some of the Bootstrap we've already covered. Right? I've already demonstrated some of these topics, but we'll quickly go over that just to make sure we're all on the same page. So yeah, so I think we're pretty much at the where we should be. Next week, or maybe even today, I don't know. Maybe we might get ahead a little. We'll get a chance to start talking about JavaScript. We'll talk about JavaScript, JSON, jQuery, AJAX to be able to connect to third-party APIs or connect back to the server. And for the next next 3 weeks, we'll be spending our time with JavaScript using AngularJS, one of the more popular MVC JavaScript libraries, and we'll dive into single-page application earnestly. Right? Up to this point, we've been working with mostly static pages, right? That link to each other using just hyperlinks. The way you would classically build some of these pages. And as many of you have noted, there's a lot of redundancy, right? There's copied over and over, right? The sidebar is going to be copied over and over, so we want to move into to use techniques that will allow us to break the page into smaller pieces, right? Into a snippet of code that we can then dynamically load and build the page dynamically, right? The header would be a module, maybe the sidebar would be a separate module, right? Each one of the contents might be a separate module that can be loaded dynamically. So we'll be able to do all that when we introduce JavaScript next week. Okay. All right. So let's see. Assignments. Okay, we went definitely. So this is an assignment that you're working on. We went over the project proposal. Yes. On Tuesday, I think we went over fairly in detail, right, of what is it that is expected, right? That there should be 2 users. There should be various use cases. Those use cases should drive your front end. Although the front end, I already put some guidelines of what that front end might be, right? Being a home page, a profile page, some kind of search capabilities, search results, a details page, right? And we also talked about what is expected in each one of those pages, right? Domains page, a domain object page, details page should have reviews or comments or some shared content that can be viewed by different users that participate in your particular community, right? And the domain object can be anything that you choose. And we talked about that most of the data will be available outside, right? And a third party will be hosting the data. You will be dynamically connecting to these third-party APIs. retrieving data just for display purposes. Nothing will be stored in the database unless you need to remember something, right? That somebody's following something, or somebody's bookmarked it, or somebody made a comment, or somebody made a review. Those things that you need to make some entry in your database so you can remember these things, right? You need to store this state. But otherwise, it should allow you to just peruse and browse and explore, right, the data that is remote, right, that is being hosted remotely, right? And we talked about how users should be able to collaborate, perhaps follow each other, maybe send messages to each other, right? And that in their profiles, they should be able to see all the data that is associated to that particular user, right? Any reviews that they may have written, any comments that they may have created, any bookmark data that they might have added to their profile, right? Should allow you to update these things, do all the CRUD operations, such as bookmark things. Those are create, right? Bookmark or review, those are creates. You should be able to update them, delete them, and the typical CRUD operations. Right, so we went over that on Tuesday. Any questions? And again, if you have if you want to meet privately, we can go over if your particular project doesn't fall within these guidelines. I would expect that 90% of the projects will fall within these guidelines, right? But there will be some outliers there that maybe you're working with another department, right? You want to create a product for them, or maybe you have a client that you're working for now, or maybe a friend who's asking you to do certain things, right? And there might be some very peculiar requirements, yes, that fall outside of these requirements, of these guidelines. If you fall within these guidelines, again, you're free to just start working on it, right? There's no need for us to meet, right? But if you do fall out of these guidelines, or if there's any doubt, please see me, and we can negotiate what it could be. All right. Okay. All right. So I believe we completed the examples and experiments for CSS. Right. We completed that on Tuesday. Just to make sure, did we talk about grids? We need to talk about grids. Okay. Visibility, maybe? Yeah, okay, so perhaps we stopped here in float and grid. So let me just go over float real quick, since floating and grids are somewhat related to one another. So actually, let me go back up a little bit in visibility and just review that when we looked at it on Tuesday. If you'll notice, these are three rectangles implemented using just plain old divs, right? We can explore and inspect the page by right-clicking on the page and selecting inspect, and our inspector tool appears on the right-hand side. One of the tabs here is the sources, right? That allows us to view all the source code that was downloaded from the server. In this case, it's downloading from the portal page, where this is for a portal website where this exercise is being hosted. We can see that just a single HTML file was downloaded, right? We see that we have the three divs, right? This is the text, the verbatim text file that was downloaded and copied locally, right? It looks just like the file that lives on the server, right? And you can see that. We have a style element at the top, and then we have three divs at the bottom, and we see that each one of them has IDs, yellow, blue, and red, and we see that at the top we have stylings for each one of them, right, making them those colors, yellow, blue, and red. Notice that there's some attributes that have been commented out. Notice that the commenting is you comment CSS. Unlike you comment HTML, and HTML use the pointy brackets with the bang and dashes, right? Whereas CSS, being a completely different language, right, we use slash and stars, right, like you would in Java or C or C++, that kind of commenting. So be careful where which you comment. In JavaScript, you can do both, right? You can do the multiple line like this, or you can do the slashes. Slashes don't work in CSS. Only slash and star. Okay, so be careful how you comment various languages. So anyway, so we've commented out two pieces, visibility and display. And this example just illustrates how we can control the visibility of various portions of the page. There's two main ways that we're going to consider here. One of them being controlling the visibility attribute of the style of an element, or the display attribute. Right. If we go to the Elements tab, this is the domain object representation. Right. Once the browser parses this static text file, this is its representation. Notice that it's added HTML, head, body, right? It created a domain, an object model out of the page, and added, the appropriate nodes, right? The appropriate pointers and instances that the way it's interpreting it. For instance, my style element puts it in the head, and everything else puts it in the body. As I highlight, the left-hand side highlights. If I highlight each one of these, it highlights and shows me which one is referring to. If I click on this one, notice that the only thing that I have is the background color blue. I just have blue color. Plus, notice the visibility and display are, they have a stripe through because they've been commented, right, in the source code. Right? So this is the way it represented that we're not applying this style. And then the last one, red, is the one down below that only has the red background. Let's look at blue, since happens to be in the middle. And if we turn on one of these attributes, such as visibility hidden, you'll notice that it just disappears. But it disappears in such a way that it's still there, right? Notice that even though it's not being rendered, right, we don't see any of the content, the coloring, and anything, it's still being used to calculate the locations and width and heights of its neighbors, right? So it's still there. It's just not being rendered, right? This is different if you turn on. We've used another attribute, similar attribute called the display, right? And the display none allows us to view the page as if that element had never been considered in the DOM, right? What would it look like if it were even there, right? And we will use this this technique of toggling displays none and block. Turn this on and off programmatically from JavaScript to be able to implement some things such as toggle content when you push a button or a link, right? And maybe you have lots of content, right? And you create collapse areas, right? That toggle, they appear and disappear, right? And this is how we're going to achieve this feature, right? Notice that visibility is not what we really want, right? Because it's the space is still taken, right? It's still it doesn't relinquish the height, right, of the page. So we are going to use a display instead. Anyway, so notice that it's rendering these divs. These divs are rendering by default. How? Like any block element does, right? The rules are that basically they take the width of the entire page, right? Anything inside it behaves inline, right? It just renders from left to right. And then it wraps if it doesn't fit, and it grows in height, right, to make up for space vertically. Yes, that's the default behavior. And then at the end of that div, when it closes the tag, right, it adds vertical spacing. It says, okay, the next element renders in the next line, right, and that's how this blue, right, is rendered after the yellow. So yeah, I wanted to just show you this because the next experiment, which is float, takes exactly the same three boxes, the same three divs, right, which were originally rendered as blocks, right, and it changes the behavior in which they are rendered now. Now, before they were rendered vertically, right, one on top of the other, stacked one on top of the other, whereas now these are being rendered side by side, as in columns, and notice that as I change the width of the page, right, you'll notice that it wraps, right? If it doesn't fit, right, then it stacks. It goes back a little bit back to the original behavior, right, which is rendering vertically. Okay, so we see that that this layout, somewhat is useful in various widths of the page, right? If the page is wide enough, right, it takes advantage of the width of the wide layout of the page, right? And also it's using a very common layout in publishing, right? That that it's very familiar when you read magazines and newspapers, right? That we love to consume content in this particular layout, right? As opposed to having very wide paragraphs that make it harder for to read, right? To go from one side of the page all the way to the end of the page and then come back to the beginning, right? So this is a very popular way of breaking up the content into columns, right? And it plays nice. It works nicely when you have wide screens, but when you have smaller screens, we would like for that content to be responsive and say, well, I don't fit, right? The most common thing to do to deal with this is just, well, I will just wrap, right? I'll go from a horizontal layout to a vertical layout, and this seems to behave accordingly, right? So this is equally readable on a phone, right? That I can scroll, or is equally readable maybe on a tablet or even on a desktop. See that? Okay, so that's what we mean by generating content that is friendly to various layouts. Let me just minimize this. So let's see how we accomplish this. So the raw HTML, right? We can look at the source code. This is the raw HTML that came along. So I can click on float. You'll notice that we have the same exact 3 divs that were there in the previous example, right? We have div, yellow, blue, red, and we still have the same 3 styles that we had originally, right? Red, blue, and yellow, right? The only thing that we've added here is that we've added this COL, right? Additional class, right? So one thing that I would like to point out is that in the classes attribute, you can list and you can combine any number of classes separated by spaces. See that? Right. So 2 rules, 2 styling rules are being applied to this one div, right? And based on the whatever rule we have on that we have declared on the style. So what we're doing here is that we're declaring the rules, right? We see that is .col, right? .col. So that applies to anybody who has the that class associated with it, right? And what are we doing? They are all being applied a float left, right, and a width, right? It's a static width of 200 pixels. See that, right? So let's talk about float left. We already know what width 200 does, right? So imagine we turn off float. So what would that do? Okay, so let's go back to the element where we can see live, right? What these look like, and we can highlight each one of these. Let's make this a little smaller so that we can play around with this. If we go to the COL and we turn off float, notice that they still behave like blocks, right? Well, almost. We've only overrode the width policy, right? Because the default policy for block elements is to take up the entire width of the page, right? But we've overwritten that and it says, no, I don't want to take the entire width of the page. I want to be this static width of 200, right? And that's what it does. But we still are honoring the policy that at the end, when it closes, right, we add a new line, right? Everything is added. So even though it fits on the right-hand side, notice that the blue and the red are still rendered vertically, right? So we haven't overwritten that behavior, okay? But when we turn on float, we're overriding that behavior. We're saying, hey, stick to the leftmost side of your container. Our container being body, right? The body is the container of these 3 divs, right? But we could have a narrower context, right? A smaller div, maybe off to the side or something, right? It would float to whatever it's leftmost of the parent, right? In this case, the parent is the body, right? That's why it's floating all the way to the left-hand side, Okay, and then this behavior sticks with whatever comes after, any other content that comes after this element, right? Everything after this element would just kind of like wrap around, right? If there were any text here, right, would just wrap around this this element, the yellow element over here, the yellow box, right? And that's what's happening with blue and red, right? They're all being applied the left float, right? And so they're all kind of like sticking right to the leftmost of its parent, right? We would like to be able to control this floating, right? Maybe we don't want everything to just float to the left-hand side. We would like to be able to toggle this behavior, right? So sometimes I want to do this, sometimes not, right? Sometimes I want to kind of like go back, right, to the default behavior of just going vertical. Yes, right, and we can control that as well. But for now, notice that float left allows us to achieve this kind of side-by-side laying out of the page. Okay, so let's look at how we can control. We can have more control over the layout, right? So let's look at grid over here. So grid. Notice this content over here. This content, right? It's kind of laid out in a kind of like a grid system. It looks like there's several rows, right? Maybe this is one single row, right? Maybe this is another row, and this is another row down here, right? And each row seems to have columns. See that? This first row has 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 columns. The second row seems to have 4 columns, whereas the last one seems to have 2 columns, right? And we've used, to achieve this side-by-side rendering of content, we've used float left. Okay, but with the addition that we have wrapped it, right, with a parent div, right? Before the float, right, the parent was just body, right? So everything was wrapping to the top, leftmost content of that was there because there was nothing there, right? But now we've gone a little more control over that and says, well, no, I just don't want it to show anywhere, in the leftmost. I want to control exactly where you end up. I'll wrap you with this row. Okay. Also, I'd like to point out that early on, when HTML just came out and people were, the content became started to become. There was an exponential growth in the content. Well, even today there's still exponential growth, but then there it was too young. There were no good practices out there, right? It was originally HTML was intended for sharing, scientific documents with other colleagues, but it was so easy. It just grew on its own, right? It just took on a life of its own, and people just started using it. And early on, to achieve this kind of layout, right, it was very common to use tables, right, to achieve this kind of layout, right? It was we saw how newspapers and art and magazines, how they laid out their content. Says, ooh, we can copy, we can borrow a lot of ideas from that, and there was no native way of doing this, right? Early on, and the easiest way to do this was to use tables, or should I say, to misuse tables, right? Because tables allowed us to break up, right, content in rows and columns, right? And you can span across several columns, right? Or you can span across several rows, yes, right? And it allowed us to lay out the content easily. This certainly has fallen out of favor, and today, we use very little or nothing at all elements that are used for styling purposes, such as centered or bold or italic or underline, right? Instead, we prefer to use style sheets to achieve the same effect, right? Since these are two distinct skills, right? And also it's a very nice way of splitting up the concerns, right? One is concerned with the logical layout, right, and the semantics and the meaning of the content that you're putting in the HTML, whereas CSS is more with how it's going to look like, right? And there should not be any cross-pollination of these two concerns, right? So anyway, so definitely we're not using tables to achieve this kind of layout, Right? Instead, we want to use CSS to do this. And we already hinted at how we could do this kind of layout in the previous example. So let's look at how this was achieved. Let's inspect the page, right? And if we look at the body, we'll see that the top level there's a div, right, with a class called container. See that, right? If you've been playing around with Bootstrap, this class should be familiar to you, or maybe not yet. Anyway. But the container, it's actually one of my classes, right, that illustrates the use of this behavior. Notice that the content has a fixed width, right? And notice that it's centered on the page. It's a very common layout, right? And you have these margins on the left-hand side. We already did this in the previous example, right, where we're centering the content, right? And the way we did that is by giving a width and putting the margins auto, right? And that's exactly what the container does, right? The container class, if you go in there, we'll see that container, that's what it does. It applies a width of 600, and then it centers, right? It centers itself on the page using margin auto. See that? Also, notice that I chose a width of 600. This value of 600 is meaningful, right? In that it's a nice number, it's a nice round number that is divisible by 12. Okay, it's divisible by 12. Right, into equal parts, right, into whole numbers, right, and we'll see the meaning of why that's relevant, okay, in a minute, right? So let's see the layout of the page. We'll see that we have container surrounding everything, and under there we have several rows, right? These rows. Here's the first row up here, this one. Then we have the second row, which is down here. Right, and then the last row, right, it's the one that's down here. Okay, and notice that they are distinguished by this row class, right, that's being applied to each one of these divs, right, and under each one of them, we'll see that there are several other divs, right, that are distinguished by classes that they all start with this COL. See that? See, they all start with COL. Notice that all rows have similar layouts, right? You have the row here, and then you have these columns. Notice as I hover over them, right, the columns are highlighted. Okay, and the naming tries to elicit the same kind of functionality that a table would give us, right? We can't use tables, but we would love to have the same features that a table gave us, right? Being able to span, being able to break up the page into pieces. So we can achieve the same kind of features, but with straight CSS. So we have the first row here having 6 columns. Right? Notice that they all have this column -2. Okay. What that comes from is that the meaning is that I am presumably spanning. This is a column that actually is spanning 2 columns, right? Meaning that there are even smaller columns, right? And if you do the math, right, notice that there are 6 columns, each one spanning 2. Then there should be 12 columns in total, right? Or a max number of columns of 12, right? So why 12? This 12 keeps popping up. 12. Well, 12. It's a very common number that is used in media and print media and also here in web design, because it's nice. Again, it's a nice round number, right? It's divisible by any number of values. Or you're divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, right? 6, and it's nice. It's also nice that you can combine all these with all sorts of combinations, right? You can have one column, really tiny column, and then a big column of 11, right? It makes up a 12 column total. So you can divvy it up any which way you want, as long as if you want to fill up an entire row, right? All the columns, all the spans add up to 12, right? And these certainly do. So we have column 12, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2 all the way through, right? And we have 6 of them, so 6 times 2, we have 12. Make sense, right? And notice that this content is already fairly narrow, right? But we can go even narrower with a column -1, right? Although that'd be very, very narrow, it would almost make no sense to go even narrower than that, right? So typically, column of span 1, right? It is the smallest you could possibly have a content be, as wide as that. Make sense, right? So the way that this was achieved is this column 2. If we go to the styling, column 2 is basically what it does is that it floats left, right? Right, floats the content left, right, and then gives it a width of 100, right? Meaning all these columns are 100 wide, right? And they all, it says there's 6 of them, they all add up to 600, right? So their width is based on the total width of whatever the container is going to be, right? That makes sense, right? And then you can calculate all the other ones, right? Column 1, the smallest, would be 50 pixels, right? 2 spans would be 100, 3 spans would be 150. So each one would be an increments of 50, right? As you span each one as bigger, right? So what this allows us to do is to create or achieve the same functionality that table gave us, right? But with a much better control over what it looks like, right? Certainly in tables, it wouldn't allow us, for instance, be responsive, not easily anyway. Right. So, for instance, if a page started to grow or shrink, right, it wouldn't let us to easily perhaps stack content on top of each other, right, to be responsive with phones, right. We would have to achieve other ways of doing it. Anyways, but tables are meant for tabular data, right? Do not use tables for laying out pages. Right? You can achieve similar things with style sheets. Anyway. So following this idea, this is exactly what Bootstrap and other layout grid systems out there, this is what they do, right? They create these classes, right, that allow you to break up the page into grids, okay? And we'll see that, this is something that we can do on our own and play around with and do ourselves, yes? But certainly, Bootstrap and all these other styling libraries, theirs is much more robust, right? Much more sophisticated. They take into account various width of pages, not just 600, right? But it's dynamic and it grows and shrinks based on the size of the page. We'll visit that in a couple minutes. Yes.
Can I see the row class?
Oh yeah. So the row class. So the row class, the only thing that it does is that, here's a row, and I will divvy it up into columns in there, and everything's floated inside of that row. So it creates a context in which I want everything to float inside of that row because I want columns in there, right? But I don't want this behavior to spill over, right, to other content. I want to make it part of only this row, right? Everything else should behave the way they want to behave. Right? If you all of the content inside, right? Only the content inside is right. So if it be more content, it just makes it wider. So notice that this particular row is much taller. It is much taller. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what if like one of the column has like longer content compared to the other one?
Yeah, that it's you would decide what to do, right? If you want to give it a height, right, which would look better, and one of the columns could be hidden, right? But typically you want it to be able to grow independently, right? Or perhaps the one that has a wider content, perhaps it shouldn't be there, right? Or maybe it should span 2 columns, right? Or it should break at a particular width and a particular height, and give a link to view it more elsewhere, right? Or pop up and show it more content. Sorry, you have a question? Okay. You want to share a question or? All right, great. All right, so notice that ours is not as sophisticated as Bootstrap, right? Bootstrap, we'll notice that notice it doesn't fit. Bootstrap would allow you to start wrapping these things, right, and stack them up on top of each other. But at least we understand, or we can extrapolate on how these grid systems achieve what they do, right? Of breaking rows and columns, right? Make sense? Right. Notice that I was perhaps not creative enough, and I broke everything into equal spans, right? The first one, they're all span 2s. In the second row, they all span 3s, right? And there's 4 columns, span 3, that's 12, right? 3 times 4 is 12. Down below, we'll have 2 columns of 6 spans, right? 2 times 6, that's 12, right? In this last one. But you could do any combination, right? You could do 6 here, and then 1, 1, and 1, right? Or 6, 2, 2, and 2, right? Or 6, right? 3 and 3, right? You can certainly combine columns any which way you want, right? Always making sure that the content looks, not jaggedy, right? That as you were suggesting, right? That perhaps you control the height, so and then let them read it elsewhere. Yes. Yes. Yep.
Is it possible to do it percentage so that as and when the sizes are different, it's still more
right.
dynamic?
Yeah, we'll talk about that just in a few, in the next example. But to your point, the way most of these grid systems work is that they provide behavior or a reliable behavior for a set of screen sizes, right? So they'll target 4 or 5 well-known sizes, right, out there in the industry, and they'll target them in a logical order, right? It says I'll target large screens, medium screens, small screens, extra small screens, and what they'll do is that they'll dynamically choose one of these style sheets that targets your particular device, right? And so, well, this looks nice on desktop applications, right? And as you resize their windows, they stick to that size. They don't do percentage, right? They don't do percentages. Percentages make sense when on really tiny screens, right? Because you just don't have any space to play around too much with the layout. But on big screens, they prefer to designers prefer to have a predictable layout of the page, right? That as you move around, right? They prefer to jump between 3 or 4 style sheets that target different sizes, right? But they're all predictable, right? So that things don't start wrapping around or start behaving weird as you proportionally change the sizes. And that's exactly what Bootstrap does, and that's what we're going to take a look at right now.
But then, how is it that how do designers start? Because in today's world, a website can be viewed either on a tablet or a phone or a desktop.
Yep.
How is that?
Yeah, let's take a look at that. Okay, so let's look at Bootstrap. So Bootstrap implements its grid system, right? And it implements 4 versions of the grid system, okay? Targeting different versions of various devices out there, right? They target large screens, medium screens, small screens, and extra small screens, right? And the way the policy is that if you choose large screens, right? I'm targeting large screens. That means that anything smaller than a large screen is proportional. Percentage is based on percentages, right? But anything that is at least a large screen or bigger, this is the layout that I want. Okay, and it's very predictable. And these are the columns that I want. These are the rows that I want. Okay, or if you choose a medium-sized screen, that means that you're targeting medium-sized screen, smaller screen, maybe it's large tablets, right, and above, right? So large tablets plus any desktop applications, and you want the layout to be more or less the same for those medium-sized screens and above, right? And then you choose between two versions of the same style sheet, right? And you grow and shrink, right, proportionally between these two. But anything below a medium-sized screen becomes percentages, right? So images shrink percentages, right? Or things start just wrap and are still viewable on a smaller screens, right? So let's take a look at the first one, large. So here we have a layout where we're using Bootstrap's grid system, right? And it looks like here we're using a row with two columns, and in the second one we have rows that use 3 columns of 4, spanning 4 each, right? 4 here. The first one, the second row here is 2 because we have columns that span 6 and 6, right? Adding up to 12. This last one down here with the 3s, right? It looks like we have 4 columns, each one spanning 3. Right? And it uses more or less the same idea that we just explored a couple minutes ago, right? But if you notice, right, if I start becoming smaller and smaller, and I no longer am a large screen, okay? When I no longer am a large screen, it flips, right? It flips and says, oh, it doesn't fit, right? I'm going to switch to a different style sheet, right? And anything that grows smaller than that style sheet is just going to be proportional. Right, so if I become smaller and smaller and smaller, right, it goes back to even a smaller one, and even a smaller one, right, until it just starts to everything be proportional and wrap around, right? So basically, what you're saying here is that I want this policy for large screens. Everything else, right, everything else, switch to what it would display with something that's smaller than this. It just stacks. It goes back to a stacking. The way that it achieves this is by using a mechanism called media rules, right? Media rules, even though they're very, very useful in creating these mechanisms, right? And they're very, very useful for implementing responsive design, have actually been around for quite a while, right? They've been around much before we even thought of having all these, targeting different size screens and mobiles and whatnot. Media rules were originally intended for instance, providing style sheets for different devices, right? For instance, if I want to print it, I would like to use a style sheet that perhaps removes all the colors, right? Maybe uses a particular font, removes and hides the headers and the menus, right? Any ads, any marketing. I just want to be printer friendly, right? So media rules allow you to state, right, or configure, right, what style sheets do you want to use, right, for different predicates or for different rules, for different reasons, right? So you could say for print or for projector or for the screen, right? So these are all different types of media. Maybe on a projector, because I'm presenting, I might want a bigger font, right? Maybe a lot of contrast. But on the screen, if this is being viewed on a desktop, I do want all the marketing. I want lots of colors and very, very a lot of eye candy. Make sense? So there's one particular aspect of media rules that allow you to target the size of the screen. The size of the screen. You can say, for screens between, for a maximum size of this or a minimum size of that, I want to use this CSS style sheet, right? And for this other size, style sheet. Okay? And this is how Bootstrap is able to flip between 2 style sheets. Right now it's using the large style sheet, but when it reaches a threshold, it flips. It says, no, I don't want to use that style sheet anymore. I want to use this other style sheet. Okay, and as it becomes smaller and smaller and smaller, it says, oh, now I want to use a different style sheet, and so on and so forth, right? Now, these rules, media rules, it can either be split up into separate individual style sheets, right? Or they can all live in a single style file, right? With the wrapped media rules, delimiting, right, the various rules that you want for different sizes of those screens. Right? If you go to Bootstrap, they document this very well. If you go to their section of grids, grid system, right? These are the rules that this is how they achieve their rules, right? They're saying add media, right, and then provide the sizes, right, for extra small, medium, and large, right? And these values of medium and large and small, right, are written down here, right? What do they mean? What do they consider to be a large device or desktop? Anything bigger than 1200, they consider to be a large desktop. Okay. Anything between 992 and 1200, they consider to be a medium size screen. Right? Anything between 768 and 992, they consider that to be, right, a small device. Right? Maybe a tablet in portrait, in portrait, right? Not portrait, sorry, landscape. Yes.
Suppose we have a 3/4 style sheet.
I'm sorry.
Suppose we have 3/4 style sheet.
Yes.
And if we open it somewhere in a phone or something, will it download all the style sheets?
Yes. Yep. Being Bootstrap, they all live in the same style sheet, right? And what they do is that the styling is inside of these ellipses over here. You know, in there is where you have all the classes, right? All the styling is within those curly brackets, right? And the styles in there, you know, what determines how, you know, what the size of the content is, right? The container, right? Is determined inside of those pointy dots, those 3 dots. And there's tons and tons of classes in there, and they are only true, right? These are only true for, you know, screen sizes that are bigger than 1200. Okay, but if the screen is between the small and max of small, right? Then these take effect, and then these take effect if it's something smaller and whatnot, right? Okay, so what it does is that you see how it as I resize this, the width of the container starting from here to here, all the way here, right? They tell you that the size of that container is 1170. Okay, if you go a little bit smaller, it switches to that width, and that width is 970. Right, and then where are we? If it keeps going, right, now it becomes 750. And anything below that, there is no width. There is no width. It just takes up. It behaves like a regular block, right? It takes up the entire width of the page, right? And if it doesn't fit, it just wraps and stacks underneath. Make sense? So this is a grid system. There's a separate layout mechanism called the fluid layout, right, where things do wrap and move and things, and that's an alternative way of laying out pages, and we'll talk about that a little later. Okay, so if we look at the source code, let's look at the source code. Let me move it down below so we can take a look at this. You'll notice that this particular row here, right? We can highlight it. We can see the elements down here. We can look at all the rows. Right, here's our first row up here. That one right here, right? And then we have the second row, and then down below that we have the third row. That one, right? So we can highlight it, right? So if we look at the second row, yes, yes. Yeah. No, the layout stays the same. Right.
So but then there will be times wherein, you know, irrespective of what the screen size is,
yeah,
you need some common feature.
Some what? I'm sorry?
Common feature.
Yeah.
Or common characteristics that you want to display.
Yes.
So how do we handle that? Because
like for instance, a menu or something that. What do you mean? Something common? Like a footer, header? What do you mean?
Just the 6 part.
Uh-huh.
Or to display has 3-4 features, the same image or color or font, something like that.
Yeah.
So since we have 4 different conditions,
right,
different screen sizes, one of them is going to be selected.
Yes.
But the only difference between the 4 is going to be the size. So that's how the layout will be.
Right.
But apart from that, everything else is going to be the same design.
Yes.
So won't that be repeated in 4 different places?
Yeah. So you don't repeat, right? Bootstrap repeats all this, right? Okay. Bootstrap is creating all these styles, and if you look at them, they look exactly the same, right? One after another. The only difference is that the sizes are different, right? And obviously, they don't do this by hand, right? They have scripts that do this, right? that calculate all this, you know, using less, right? And they run these scripts and generate these styles. All this, they all look exactly the same, right? With the sizes are all different, right? The only thing you're doing is just you're including this and the behavior. You're inheriting all this behavior. You can override these behaviors, right? That you don't like those widths. You can change those widths and override them. But these are the. You're also free to download their original .less, right? And change their scripts. And you don't want to target 1200. Maybe you want to target some other size, right? And you can recompile, right, and have your brand new Bootstrap version, right? The problem with that is that now you own the Bootstrap, right? So that's something that I want to comment. I wanted to comment on Piazza. Somebody was saying, can I change dashboard.css? Somebody asked. In general, if you're either downloaded somebody else's CSS or you're linking to somebody else's CSS, right? If you're using somebody else's CSS, right? In general, right, you should not modify those CSS. Okay. Oftentimes, the CSS are part of a development and deployment cycle, right? That goes through its own QA, and there's a whole, slew of teams that are responsible for that CSS, right? If you start mucking around with it, right, you kind of like own the file now. Now you are responsible for making sure that if you did something and you broke it, it's yours, right? You're no longer participating in that development of that file. Also, you risk making those files incompatible with future versions, right, of those files, right? So imagine you download a Bootstrap, right, and now you're responsible if you want to use a future version of Bootstrap, that you would have to migrate your changes, right, to the new version of Bootstrap. See that? Right, so it just complicates the maintenance of these files, right? Instead, what? Yes. I'm sorry. Twitter. They participate in the open source community. You will find that there's tons and tons and tons of free source codes out there. Okay, there's tons of libraries that. Whatever you can possibly think of, right? As somebody has written a free open source solution to whatever you can possibly think of, right? And people participate in these communities, and it's part of the culture of wanting to become part of this larger community and become one of the coolest things you could possibly write in your resume is that you participate in one of these open source projects, right? And that you added certain features and whatnot, and the community looks at your content and they praise you, and certainly you can win all sorts of badges and all sorts of and that would be really, really cool. Yes. Question? Yes.
Will this respond to if I wrote my phone virtually?
I'm sorry?
Will this get response to if I have my phone?
Oh, certainly, yes. Yes, certainly. The size of the screen, right? Whenever the browser resizes, right? It internally it has its own event handlers, right? And anybody who's interested in the size can listen in for these sizes, right? And all sorts of things happen. One of the things is that everything gets recalculated, right? As you scroll, as you pinch and zoom or resize or move windows around, all those affect the rendering of the page. So as you move your phone, right, that too, right, that resizes the page, and then the whole thing gets re-rendered and recalculated of where things fall. Yep. Okay. So yeah. So these are the various rows. If you open it up, right, you'll notice that you have these columns, right, and they're almost the same. They're very similar to what we did in the previous example. See that? We have this COL, and we have these -6. You see that? The -6, and you can guess what they do, right? These are kind of like the spans that we introduced in the previous example. They said I want to span 6 columns, right? So that's basically half of the entire content. That's basically what I'm saying. I want to take up half of the entire content. and the other half is being taken up by this other div. See that? But this, and they all behave like that. So if you look at this one down below, we'll see that we have 3 of these with spans of 4, 4, 4, and 4. You see that? So I want to. This means I want to take up a third of the content, right? This is another third and another third, right? But notice that it has an additional nomenclature here. See that? It has this LG. So not only does it say it has span, but there's this LG, right? So this what I had mentioned earlier is that what this is doing is that I am targeting. I want this to be true. I want these columns. I want this float to be true only for large screens. I don't want this to be true for smaller screens. I want the float to happen only in larger screens and above. Well, there's nothing bigger than large. But anything smaller than large, it should go to the default behavior, right? No floats, everything wraps, everything stacks up vertically, right? And that's exactly what's happening, right? When it gets big, smaller than the large, right? Everything starts to stack up, right? And it becomes tablet friendly or phone friendly or whatever, okay? So all the other ones, right? If I go on to the next example, medium screen, you'll notice that at first it looks exactly the same as the previous one, right? Same layout, right? But instead of using the LG nomenclature, right, we use the MD version of the column sizes, right? And in this case, what happens is that again, right? We start resizing the screen, and when it reaches a threshold, notice that it maintains the same layout, right? The same columns, right, for large screen or medium-sized screens. But if it goes below a medium-sized screen, it reverts to the default behavior, right, of just stacking the content on top of each other, right? And then it just goes with the take up the 100%, right? 100%, and everything starts to just wrap. Make sense? And so yeah, so the only difference that you'll find here, right? The only difference that you'll find between these two is that the columns, right, have this MD nomenclature as opposed to LG, right? Yes.
So in that case, we should target a very small screen and probably the scales for all the screens. Is that a good idea?
No. So yeah. So let's look at. Let's get smaller and smaller and smaller. Right. So, well, okay. Maybe you can answer that yourself, right? So notice that these 4 columns down below, which looks, fairly makes acceptable on large screens, right? And then you get smaller and smaller, and so it's still acceptable maybe on a large tablet, right? But imagine what this would look like on a phone, right? 4 columns side by side on a tiny screens. It would be unreadable, right? It would not be acceptable, right? So no. So typically you maybe start with the medium, right? And says, well, anything smaller, I'm safe. I know that if they go smaller than this, it's just going to stack, right? It's just that you need to visit it and make sure that the stacking order makes sense, right? Notice that there's an order here. Typically, you want to read from left to right. Anyway, in this culture, we read from top to bottom, left to right. And then when they stack, they read, first this, and then this from top to bottom. They stack. Yes. So these other versions, small and extra small, right? They all lay out the same way, right? Again, this is medium screen, and then these are small screens. What this is saying is that, hey, I don't care that the screen is getting smaller. I still want to maintain the same layout, right? So I want to maintain this layout and above, right? Anything smaller is just wraps. Notice that these layouts are much more sophisticated than ours. Notice that they add padding around it, right, and margins between the contents, right? Typically, they add 15 pixels around each one of these, right, so that they're not flush against each other. That's another thing you should consider when you're writing your own content, right? You make sure that you have proper white spaces, right? That things are not flush, Right? If they're flush, it's because you meant it to be flush, right? Because you wanted it to be flush, not because you didn't look at it, or it's just you didn't think about it, right? Make sure that things have nice spaces in between them. If you stick to the grid system or to the Bootstrap templates, right, and their snippets of code, you should be fine, right? They add their own paddings, their own margins and whatnot to make it look pretty. If you start straying away and you start creating your own templates, well, make sure to revisit it and make sure that things are flush when you want it to be flush and not flush when they should not be flush. Okay, here, flush would not be acceptable, right? This is meant for humans to read this, and humans love white spacing. Yes?
Can we apply, like for 6, we can apply small screen template for 4 medium and for 3 large screen?
I'm sorry, say again?
Like for that 6 pan,
Yep.
you can apply the large.
Yes, you can. Yeah, so that column XS something, you can combine it with column medium, whatever, right? And those XS or MD or LG, what this is saying is that this will only apply for large screens, meaning for lower screens, this does not apply. So you can combine them, right? You can combine them and say, on large screens, I want 4 columns. But on medium-sized screens, I want 2 columns, and then below, just wrapped around. So you can combine them, and they only apply for that nomenclature, right? LG will apply only for large screens, right? MD will only apply for medium-sized screens, and so on and so forth. So yeah, definitely, you can combine them. Obviously, you would have to choose a layout that will look good on both, right? So for instance, something that is divisible in both cases, right? So something that is will be 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1, 2, 1, 2, right? So 4 is nicely divides in half, right? Same thing in 6, right? You can do 2 6s and then 2 3s, right? So you would have to play around with the combinations, right? So that it looks nice on both. Yeah, good question. So this is extra small, and so it maintains the layout regardless, even in the smallest one, right? Even in the smallest one. And notice that this is totally unacceptable, right? That this is just illegible, right? And definitely not. I would not hope that you would choose something like that. That makes sense? Everything? Okay, great. Forms. I believe we've already gone about forms. The only thing that I'd like to point out is that HTML5 introduced quite a bit of other types of forms, right? It introduced several in the type attribute of input fields. Now they're more extensive, right? Date has been there for a while, but now you have ranges that it can render as sliders, right? Obviously, these don't mean anything unless you couple it with JavaScript, right? But nevertheless, you can render it natively as sliders, right? And phone browsers, Chrome and Safari will render them, with the native, however natively they render on the browser, which is nice, right? So it's very easily to bring up, just like dates, right? When you click here, this is the default date picker for Chrome, right? It'll render a little bit different on Safari. Will render a little bit different on Mozilla Firefox. And if I go on my iPhone, it'll use the native iPhone date picker, right? Or if you go with an Android, it'll use the Android native date picker, okay, which is nice. Which is why I asked you to stick to the native date picker. If you use instead a plugin, right, like jQuery, what you'll do is that you'll override and says, no, I don't want to use the default date picker for the phone. I want to use jQuery's implementations of the date picker, okay, which won't be, right, although it'll be a standard rendering across all browsers, it won't be the native right, date picker of the phone that you're targeting. Make sense? Right. So it depends. Right. On a desktop, maybe yes, I want to standardize, right, and I want to use the same date picker across all desktops. But on a phone, to give it a better experience, right, to the phone users, to use the date picker that they're already familiar with, right? Says, well, you know, I always use date picker, you know, for the calendar and, you know, all across the OS, right? Why are you giving me this this customized date picker that I've never used, right? So, you know, there's some pros and cons on whether on using plugins for date pickers or using the native date pickers, right? You have to choose, right? Nevertheless, we'll look at both. You can choose colors. So this is the native color picker for Mac, right? But on Windows, we'll have a different one. You can, and then I believe we already went over the labels. We did that last week, I think. Right, so I'm not going to go over that. We went over the basic forms, right? These were copied straight from Bootstrap. Yes.
So we can use that media thing with this if we want a specific date picker for the desktop and the native date picker for the mobile.
Yes. Right. You could. Right. So one of the classes in Bootstrap, I think it's called hide or hidden. Hidden, maybe hidden. Hidden. I don't remember. There's a hidden class that what it allows you to do is hide content, right, in different content, right, in different sizes. Whereas you might say, you know, I want this really cool menu at the top on big screens. I don't want that menu on smaller screens, right? So you could hide and show different content for different sizes, right? So the content is still there. It's just that it's been removed or added, right, depending on the size of the screen, right? So for instance, what you were mentioning, right, you could have two versions of the date picker, right? One that is takes up by jQuery, right, on large screens, but and it hides the other date picker, right, the native date picker for large screens, but if it toggles, right, so that it uses a native date picker for phones and it hides the jQuery plugin for small screens, right? You can toggle those content and target different sizes. Yeah. So I think we went over forms. Is there a need to go over that? We did that, right? The only thing I do want to point out is these checkboxes and the radio buttons. So checkboxes, as you might know already, it's you render them by saying type equal checkbox, right? And the default behavior is what we would think of, right? It's basically saying that we can choose one or more, right? None or all, right? We can select any number of them, okay? But notice that the radio buttons, right? They're rendered using type radio. See that? And if you notice, their default behavior is the same as the checkboxes, okay? Notice that now I made them mutually exclusive. See that? Right? To achieve the mutually exclusive behavior, you need to add a name attribute. You need to add a name attribute and say, hey, all these four are basically choosing just one, right? And so you can group them together by giving them the same name, right? So for instance, these all have the same attribute name equal choice, and that's why they're mutually exclusive amongst themselves, right? Just like down below here, male and female, okay? We have two. This input field, male, has a name gender, and the other one also has the name gender. That's why they're mutually exclusive, okay? And but they have absolutely nothing to do with the other checkboxes. See that? That's how you group them with name, right? I just wanted to point that out. I also wanted to point out real quick the slider. You achieve that using type equal range, right? And you give it a max and a minimum, right? Maximum. So start at, you know, a minimum 10. So that's the minimum value if you choose it down here, right? And the maximum is 20, so I can go all the way to here. So, and then you can give it a step, right? So the values would be 10, 12, 14, and so on and so forth. Yes?
I have a question about input fields.
Yes.
Input fields. How can I achieve a password style if I want to input a password
Right there.
type and I want to hide it?
Yeah, so for instance, this one is type password, and whatever you type, you can't see it, right? And the way you achieve is you say type equal password. Okay? Yep. Labels, we talked about labels. We talked about the basic Bootstrap forms. These are just copied, straight from the Bootstrap templates. I just wanted to mention file uploads. So file upload is a control that allows humans. I want to underscore that, right? Allows humans to browse your file system, as opposed to automated script, right? You cannot programmatically browse the file system, right? Since the file system, you're giving access to private data, right? Somebody else's private data. There has to be a human in the loop, right? That physically clicks on the button and then physically chooses a file to upload. You that particular file and choose it from the file system. There has to be a human who chooses. So there's some security around this, right? And there's very little customization that you can go around because of security issues, right? There are some customizations on what it looks like. So for instance, the default rendering on Chrome is to have this button, this ugly default button, right? And then the file that you choose, render right next to it, and you might want to customize that look and feel, right? There are some tricks here and there on maybe rendering something on top of it, okay, to make it look a little prettier. But again, it's very limited, and it's because of security issues. Inline forms, so that you can render them from left to right, as opposed to from top to bottom. This is useful. This is useful for maybe on a header, right, or footer, right, or something that just renders nicely and it wraps. If it doesn't, if it doesn't fit, right, if it doesn't fit, notice that it just wraps and it becomes vertical and responsive. Yes. Choose file. Oh yeah, sure. So you just say type equal file. Yeah, type equal file. Okay. It allows you to choose a single file or multiple files. Right. It doesn't actually upload anything, right? You have to add other JavaScript stuff to support it. Yes. I'm sorry. Yes, and it also works on phones as well. So for instance, it will allow you to browse your local phone system, for instance, choose an image for uploading, for instance, right? To upload an image, yes?
So I just use that like the input field doesn't have a slash.
Yeah, it should have the slash. It should have the slash. Yeah, although browsers are friendly and they understand that it doesn't have a body, right? It's just a single element. Yes.
And this will allow you to pick only one file.
No, you can choose multiple files. Yep.
So is there any way to distinguish that you have to choose one file or multiple files?
By pressing Shift or Control, you can choose.
Query that we are limiting to pick only one file.
Yes, you can configure. You says just one or so. I forget what the attribute is, but yes, this is an attribute where you can say single or multiple. Yep. All right. Okay. The only other thing that I want to point out is this one. This is a snippet of Bootstrap that I copied from their templates, which renders in such a way that you can put in front of it some symbols, right? That this is a currency that you can put some symbols before and after. Right? You can put whatever you want, but it's a nice. Notice that it flows nicely from left to right, and the corners and they're flush against each other, right? So it's a nice template to use. And I would encourage you, to use this nomenclature whenever you want to, give me an idea of what is that you're asking of me. Also, it's using notice the ghost text around it, just to give me an idea of what is that you're asking, right? And that is achieved using placeholder, the placeholder attribute, right? Horizontal forms we looked at last week, so I'm not going to go over that. Forms, tables, I think we already went over that, right? The only thing I do want to point out is that notice that this has buttons at the end. See that? These are buttons at the last column, and notice how they when you make them smaller and smaller and they don't fit, right? Notice that it definitely changes the size, but notice what happens when it becomes too small. See, the buttons wrap. Okay, that's unacceptable, right? So be careful, right? That you should fix that in your own tables, right? If remember anything that wraps is because it was meant to wrap. Okay, make sure that when you change things around and you see things are wrapping, says, "Ooh, that looks weird." Okay, you go on and fix it. One quick fix for this would be that you can go into the table, right, and we can look at the TD. That's the TD that contains those two buttons, right? And we can add a style there. We can say that for that TD, right, I'd like to add white space, and then you can configure whether you want wrapping, but you don't want wrapping. What do you want to do, right? So how do I treat the white space between elements? How do I treat it? Should they be considered in the calculation of the vertical spacing, or should they not be considered? Should it be just one single line? Okay, no wrapping. So say no wrap, right? And now everything falls nicely in the same line. You see that, right? And regardless of the size, right? It doesn't matter if it doesn't fit, right? It never wraps. Okay, and then you have to consider, right? Well, what if the table is too big and it doesn't wrap, but the whole table doesn't fit, right? What should happen? Even worse would be that I display a vertical scroll bar at the bottom, right? That if I want a scroll bar, perhaps the table itself should be responsive, right? Providing its own scroll bar so I can manipulate the table. But this table, notice that it's not responsive, and it's forcing this scroll bar at the bottom, right? Be careful, right, with scroll bars for the whole document. It forces me to scroll the entire document, which is a no-no, right? Be careful there. The only other thing I wanted to point out is that these buttons are actually implemented. Where are you? All these buttons are actually not buttons at all, right? They're implemented as hyperlinks. See that? And the reason they look like buttons is because they have the class BTN warning. See that? That's what makes it look like it's a button, right? Also, inside we're using the glyphicons, right? Which there's a whole library of glyphicons, which you can find in the Bootstrap documentation. So those are all free images that you can use for, and you should try to be as terse as you can be, trying to give them, but be clear on what is it that the action does. Notice that as I hover over, it becomes this clickable hand. See that? If it's a button or hyperlink, it should always be. This is a clickable that I can take actions on this, right? The way that's achieved is that that's the default behavior for hyperlinks. That's the default behavior of hyperlinks, and hyperlinks. I mean, that's what I said. It's a hyperlink, but hyperlinks require for them to be considered hyperlinks by the browser. They require this href. Okay, they require the href attribute. They don't really care what you put in the href attribute, but they require something in the href attribute. Classically, or typically, what we would put in here is an actual URL, right? But we're not going to do that, right? In single page applications, we're never going to navigate anywhere, right? We're not going to navigate to a different stay here, right? But we still want it to be a hyperlink. Notice if I remove that, I don't have any href. Which one was this? That one. Oh, it's still there. Wait. Which one? That one, right?
Warning, yellow one.
Warning, it's this one. No, if I highlight it, it's that one. It's still rendering the hand. Anyway, what I wanted to point out is that if, I'm sorry?
It's upper one.
No, but it's highlighting that one, right? Notice. Should be this one, right? Anyway, what I wanted to point out was that if you do not have the href attribute, right, it does not change the cursor. It does not change the cursor, right? And that's unacceptable. And we don't need the href because we're not navigating anywhere, but we have to put it, right? Because the browser wants it there, and that's what it uses to know, oh, this is clickable, right? I should put a hand. So we still want the hand. We still want the hand, even though we're not going to use the href. Okay. So you might say, well, why don't we just put the href? The browser wants the href. Yes.
There's the CSS attribute for that.
Yes. Yes. Right. That's what I wanted to point out. Right. So one what was I going to say? Oh, one way to achieve it is a very common way to achieve that is to say href hash. That's a very common thing to do, right? To put href hash, right? The problem with href hash is that notice that if I actually click on one of these, look at what happens to the URL. It adds a hash at the end. See that? You know, what's the big deal? Well, right now it's not a big deal, right? But it's going to become a very big deal next week when we start looking at Angular. Right? In Angular, this hash sign in the URL has a very special meaning. Okay, so we can't have that. We can't just have hashes coming up arbitrarily. That's why we typically remove the href. But if we remove the href, we lose the hand, right? So one typical thing to do is to style the anchors, right? Anchors by adding cursors, styling the cursors and saying all anchors, regardless of whether they have href or not, right? I want a particular cursor, right? And there's a whole bunch of cursors that you can add, right? Pointer, right? Or hand, or the default cursor, or there's tons of cursors that you can play around with, right? So just be careful, right? We'll come back to this when we introduce, when we talk about Angular. We'll come back and style this appropriately. Yes?
Why can't we have all of them as buttons?
I'm sorry?
Why can't we have all of them as buttons?
All of them as buttons.
So it highlights because I did that, and whenever you drag your cursor,
Yep.
it's like
Yep.
same thing.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah, so we could have either one, right? Now, the default behavior of either one, we're not going to use, right? Hyperlinks, navigate away. Buttons, submit forms, right? None of those two default behaviors we're not going to use, right? Now, buttons, although both can be styled to look like, Bootstrap buttons, buttons have other behaviors, like click events and generate a whole bunch of events that we don't care for, right? Hyperlinks give us more abilities to style it in which way we want, right? So typically we're going to choose hyperlinks over buttons for styling purposes, right? It just gives us more abilities to style it in any which way we want, right? Right now it doesn't really matter, right? When we start looking at Angular and things like that and put events and things like that, we want to we'll stick to hyperlinks. All right, I think that's it. Notice that these over here, we're using hyperlinks, and we did not style them as buttons. Right? And that's appropriate, right? That's perfectly appropriate. The only one thing, drop downs. What I did want to point out in drop downs is that you might know this already, that they're implemented using the select elements. But notice that it has a form control class, right? Notice that all input fields here have the form control class associated with it. And what it does is that it makes it, makes it take up the entire size of whatever the container is. Right? Makes it looks nice, plus rounded. corners. But the select statement, notice that it has options underneath. You see that? These are the options that you can drop down and see over here, right? Now, well, you'll notice that you have some text, the text in between the option attribute element. This is the human readable, human friendly label that the user sees, right? Okay, and this could be, a sentence, right? It could be something that the user is meant to read to make a choice. Yes, but notice that they have a value associated with these. See the value? This means that logically, when they select one of these drop downs, the actual value being selected is whatever you choose here: user, admin, students. Notice it's caps. Right? So one of them, these labels are meant for humans to read, whereas these values are actually programmatic and logical, and they're meant for programs, right, to read, or has a special meaning in your program. Maybe some kind of key, right, or there's some enumerated data type, right, and they mean something in your backend logic. Understand? So one of them is user friendly, whereas the other one is programmatic and system friendly. Yes. That the values, these values are text, right? Or they could be, they should be interpreted as text, right? Or they could be numeric. So if these would be 1, 2, 3, 4, right? If I say it's text, it'll be considered as a string. If I say number, it'll be considered to be numeric. Okay. I think that's all. Okay, we looked at that last week. Tables. These are just other widgets available in Bootstrap, right? You can render tabs. They don't actually behave like tabs, right? For that to behave like tabs, we need to use the Bootstrap JavaScript, right? Which we haven't talked about at all, right? For now, for the assignment that you're working on, you have 2 tabs, right? For those that feel comfortable and start playing with JavaScript, go ahead, right? If you feel comfortable using JavaScript and playing around with that behavior, you're free to go and try it out. Otherwise, the only way to implement it would be for this to be an actual hyperlink, right? That navigates to a completely different page, right? That renders this tab as highlighted, yes, and a different content, right? The problem of implementing is repeated, right? The header is repeated, the sidebar is repeated, everything is repeated twice for the 2 tabs, right? Only the content in the tab is different, right? And for now, that's okay, right? When we start JavaScript and Bootstrap JavaScript and Angular next week, right, we'll go back and revisit all this, right? How to do this dynamically using JavaScript, okay? Or if you feel comfortable, you've done jQuery already and you've done this, go ahead, all right? All right. These are just different ways of splitting up the page into smaller tabs. Pills is another way to split it up, or you can do it vertically. On a phone, you might typically use this wide rendering, right, that takes up the entire width of the page, right, instead of these tabs on the left-hand side justified to the left. So this is for large screens, right? Makes sense. But for smaller screens, right, you would take up the entire screen like this. Okay. Oops. Jumbotron. These down below are templates that you could use to get started, right? So for instance, this might be an appropriate template that you could use in the landing page, right? In your landing page, in the first index page in your public directory, right? This would be an appropriate place to start, right? It has a nice header at the top, right? It has this kind of marketing splash in the middle that says "Hello World." Perhaps you could put there a carousel, maybe a blurb explaining real quick what this website is about, right? What you're expecting me to do, some, in as few words as possible. And down below, you could be a little more verbose, right? Explaining what this is about, right? Maybe you can show some activity on your website. You can maybe list the latest folks who have joined your website, right? Or the latest content that has been created. You can, and you list it down here, right? And provide, maybe links to view more, right? View more content later on. You could, you put login above. So this is an appropriate starting point for a splash screen for your project and for your landing page for your homepage. Yes. So this is please feel free to start there, or a dashboard. This is the one that we're using for the assignment, right? It's kind of like an administrative tool where you have this left-hand side, right-hand side, more of an application, right? The other one's more of a UI, right? Whereas this one is more functional, right? It takes up the entire screen. Notice it doesn't have any paddings on the side. It's the one we use, right? And the last one is just another template that's an example template that can be useful for blogs, right? Where you have several placeholders for your headers, for blog samples, titles, who wrote it, the date that it was created, maybe some blurbs, the actual content, some quotations, and several subsections that you can put in there. Example code blocks. So these are all examples of what you could have blogs render. Obviously, yours would be dynamic, right? Your blogs would be dynamic, reading content from a database, right, and rendering this dynamically. But these are the templates that you would use, right, for rendering different types of content. Plus, you have some archives on the right-hand side and whatnot. All right, I think we're done with Bootstrap. Let's look at the agenda. Right, so this puts us at the end of Bootstrap and Grid Systems, which is today. Any questions? I think we already talked about the project proposal. That's due on the Friday, the 12th, right? Many of you have already come to me to talk about the project. Again, if it's within these guidelines, feel free to get started. Again, the riskiest part of your project is getting. So I encourage you to get that going as quickly as you can. Apply for an API, for a key, right? Start playing around with the API, making sure that it's giving you the data you expected, that it's in the format that you want it. I'm suggesting that you use JSON, right? Although, if you really want to use other formats, then that's fine. A lot of them, many of the older APIs provide their data in XML, okay? And even though it's not friendly to the browser, there are libraries that parse XML and convert it to other data formats, right? So typically you would do this on the server. And the server, you would go fetch the data on the server, right? You would parse it on the server, convert it into some friendly format, perhaps a JSON format, right? And then do whatever manipulations you need to do. Okay. If you use, I mean, there are many alternatives that are JSON, right? And which basically skips that. You don't have to. No, there's very little parsing, very little manipulation and conversion, right? So I would encourage you to stay within the JSON format, but if you feel brave enough to play around with other data format, go ahead. Okay, but yeah, get that going as fast as you can. The next project assignment will be asking you to exercise those APIs, right? Making sure that it's what you intended to do, right? That you can achieve whatever you really wanted to do. But the use cases that you're writing for the proposal, you're gonna experiment with your API whether you can actually search and render and making sure that the API will work for you. Okay, so get that going. All right, I think so this goes to 11:30.
Yes.
Yes. For the next week, please get started on the JavaScript, jQuery, JSON, Ajax, which we're going to start next week. The topics are those, right? So native JavaScript, right? The JSON, the JavaScript object notation, the jQuery library, and using jQuery's AJAX, right, to connect to remote APIs, right? We'll play around with connecting to IMDb, right? We start displaying, do a search application and see what movies come back with this API, and just get you thinking about those things. Take a look at the videos. So hopefully by next week you've viewed most of these videos, right? The JavaScript and the jQuery videos, and all these, right, for JavaScript and jQuery and AngularJS. Please go through them, right, so we can quickly move along. All right, thank you.